Welcome to the session entitled Reports from Projects Funded by Accessibility Standards Canada. A number of exciting new initiatives have been funded by Accessibility Standards Canada over the last year that focus on advancing employment opportunities for persons with disabilities. In this session, we have presentations about the work underway in 4 of these projects. First, Mahadeo Sukhai of the CNIB will talk about a project to build a universal design framework for employment standards in Canada. This project is undertaking an evidence-based approach to the development of recommended employment standards and educational resources on the application of universal design and principles of inclusion within the workplace setting, with a focus on sensory and visual processing disabilities. The goal of universal design is to ensure that any given environment, in this context, the workplace and employment setting, is usable by all people, including persons with disabilities, to the greatest extent possible, without need for adaptation or specialized design. Next, Arif Jetta of the Institute for Work and Health will talk about research that aims to better understand the types of job accommodations and workplace supports required by young people with disabilities in the future of work. He will discuss how the study will generate evidence regarding the school-to-work transition of young people with disabilities and advance knowledge of job accommodation practices and workplace inclusivity. In the third presentation, Jutta Treviranus of OCAD University will discuss a project underway to promote equitable digital systems. This project will engage a broad network of individuals with lived experience of disability and organizations of people with disabilities in co-creating resources that inform the development of standards to address the risks and opportunities presented by digital systems. Finally, we have a presentation on a research project about career transitions and accessibility in the federal public service, led by Carleton University and its READ initiative, Research, Education, Accessibility, and Design. A team of researchers and national community partners, the National Educational Association of Disabled Students and the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, is examining the barriers and facilitators to accessibility at transition points into, within, and out of the Canadian Federal Public Service for persons with disability. The project aims to build on the Federal Public Service's accessibility strategy and support the development of relevant accessibility standards in the hiring, onboarding, retention, and career development of persons with disabilities under the Accessible Canada Act. This presentation will involve a number of participants: Samantha Butler, Tara Connolly, Lorraine Godden, Janet Mantler, Mirvat Sanala, Linda Schweitzer, and the director of the READ initiative, Boris Vukovic. We will begin first with Mahadeo.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today to tell you about the work that my team at CNIB is going to undertake in collaboration with a number of our collaborators in the academic and not-for-profit communities on building an evidence-based universal design framework for employment standards in Canada. This is a project that has been funded by Accessibility Standards Canada and will run effectively until March of 2023. It's going to be an exciting endeavor, and I'm very pleased to be able to tell you about it. My name is Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai. I'm the study PI, as well as the Head of Research and Chief Accessibility Officer for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. I'm going to start with a quotation. It's one that we've probably all heard before. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Culture also eats legislation for breakfast. And one of the most interesting things to think about in the context of employment and accessibility is sort of this notion that we can't legislate culture. And I think to some degree that's true. I think to some degree that that's potentially debatable. But it's also quite interesting how in some ways we actually have legislated a culture around accessibility in the workplace. And I hope in this presentation to be able to unpack that a little bit for you. I'm going to start by saying that there's lots of precedents for employment standards out there. Obviously, there's the one here in Ontario, the AODA and its employment standard. And the Accessibility for Manitobans Act has something similar. Acts that are starting to be developed in British Columbia and Nova Scotia also have similar premises behind them. The Americans with Disabilities Act has a lot of employment-related provisions, as does the Disability Discrimination Act in the United Kingdom, and acts in Australia and other parts of the global north. There's also the Canadian Charter on Rights and Freedoms, there are provincial human rights codes, and there's the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, all of which speak to employment in some way, shape, or form. So with all of that, there's lots of precedent for the Accessible Canada Act and for employment standards for the ACA. So why is this any different? Well, as we started to do the research that went into the grant application that we submitted, one of the things that we identified is that all of these precedents that exist actually have a bit of an interesting bias associated with them. All of these current employment standards and legislation, they focus very much on hiring and onboarding. They focus on person-first approaches, and they focus on employer responsiveness. And so, as I said, you can legislate a culture. You can legislate a culture of focusing specifically on these things, which is what we have in the world of employment standards today. These standards do not focus on environmental solutions or inclusive design approaches or systemic approaches or the overarching employment lifecycle beyond hiring and onboarding. And so I think it's also worth noting that when we think about accessibility of employment, we think about inclusion in employment, I want to introduce a couple of concepts. One is this notion of what's called the transitional barrier, which is accessing the job in the workplace, versus the environmental barrier, which actually speaks to inclusion within the workplace. There's a common meme: diversity is being invited to the dance party and inclusion is being asked to dance. I'm going to add a nuance to that meme for you. Diversity is being invited to the dance party. Accessibility is getting in the front door of the dance party, and inclusion is being asked to dance. And the really interesting thing is that all of the employment standards that are out there actually speak to getting in the front door, but not actually being asked to dance. And so the distinction that I wish to draw is that the legislation speaks to accessibility, it does not speak to inclusion. And that was the core premise behind this particular project. So our objective then was to undertake an evidence-based approach to the development of recommended employment standards and educational resources on the application of universal design and principles of inclusion within the workplace setting, with a focus on sensory and visual processing disabilities. Our scope is the entirety of the employment lifecycle. So more than just recruitment, more than just hiring and onboarding, we're interested in, yes, the job interview and navigating disclosure and accommodation, but also we're interested in workplace social environment. So principles of an inclusive workplace, employer attitudes and employee attitudes. We're interested in internships and transition to work. We're interested in employer policies, inclusive of employment equity, disability, leaves and return to work policies, as well as equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility policies. We're interested in career mobility and promotion and leadership and inclusive leadership and management. We're interested in information and communication as it underpins all of the above. We have to do this work through the lenses of current events. We have to acknowledge that we are going through a once-in-a-century pandemic, which has changed for many people how work is done, even what work is and the nature of employment. And that's a panel for later. But I think it's really important to recognize that we have to do this work in the context of the pandemic and remote and digital work. We also have to acknowledge that we live in a time where we absolutely need to pay attention to intersectional identity. We can't talk about race in isolation. We can't talk about ability in isolation. We can't talk about class or gender in isolation, or any of the other myriad forms of social identities. We have to talk about intersectional identities and inclusion, and we have to do this work through that lens as well. So what are we going to do? We're going to start with gathering the evidence, understanding the literature, case studies, and consultations. We are going to conduct expert consultation interviews as part of our environmental scan. We're going to do case studies and lit reviews of best and worst practices for accessibility and inclusion standards in other jurisdictions. We're going to conduct an environmental scan of universal design standards in the workplace. We're going to develop a framework for universal design and inclusion in the workplace, inclusive of everything that I just identified. And we're going to design updated guidelines guidelines for the provision of accessible and inclusive information in the workplace. Going from there, we want to unpack how can we create a universally designed recruitment process through employment standards. We want to apply that lens of universal design and inclusive design to disability disclosure and workplace accommodation. We want to unpack employee and employer attitudes in the workplace, do a very deep and very thorough policy and practice review in the context of equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. We wish to look at and understand employment transition barriers and resources. We want to apply that lens of universal and inclusive design to internships and experiential learning programs. And we want to understand inclusive leadership and also think about employer preparedness for universal design in the workplace. And what does that tool look like? This is all going to be part of a larger accessibility and employment research ecosystem that's really brought together by the collaborators who've come into this project, and some of the funded work that they're already doing at Holland Bloorview Children's Rehabilitation Hospital and at the University of Montreal, here at the CRWDP, at McMaster University, and at George Brown College and OCAD University. Our academic collaborators come from all over. We've got partnerships with folks at NATE, the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. We've got collaborations at the University of Toronto, at OCAD University, at Ontario Technical University, at George Brown and Seneca and Centennial Colleges, at McMaster and at Queen's, and also at the University of Montreal. And we also have an international collaboration at Erasmus University and the Rotterdam School of Management. We have not-for-profit collaborators as well at Brain Injury Canada and the Centre for Research and Work Disability Policy, Holland Bloorview Children's Rehabilitation Hospital, Colleges Institutes Canada, and the Canadian Disability Policy Alliance. Thank you very much for listening. I'm very excited to be able to talk about this project and answer questions about it and tell you about it in the months and years ahead as we get started on this really important work. Thank you very much for your time and attention. You can get me at mahadeo.sukhai, mahadeo.sukhai at cnib.ca to chat about this more.
Thank you, Mahadeo, for that presentation. We're now going to turn to Arif Jetta of the Institute for Work and Health.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Arif Jetha, and I'm a scientist at the Institute for Work and Health in Toronto. And recently, I was privileged to receive funding from Accessibility Standards Canada to conduct research on the job accommodation practices for the school to work transition of young people with disabilities within the context of the future of work. And so in this presentation, I'm going to provide a rationale for the proposed research and a summary of activities my team and I plan to conduct over the next 2.5 years. And I want to start off by acknowledging our awesome team, which includes researchers and community-based organizations from across Canada who have an interest in the school to work transition of young people with disabilities. And just to start off with the background, I think it's important to highlight that we know that the school to work transition is a critical period where a person tends to establish themselves in the labor market. And what we also know, and based on the evidence, challenges with employment during this period can have a scarring effect and impact employment across the life course. And so for the 2 million young people with disabilities in Canada, there are a number of barriers to the school to work transition. And my colleagues and I addressed some of these challenges in greater depth in a previous session in this conference. So I hope you had a chance to view that one. And it's important to highlight that as the work environment changes in the future of work, new challenges and opportunities will emerge for young people with disabilities as they kind of navigate this complex period of their working life. And so what is the future of work? It's the adoption of different digital technologies coupled with socio-demographic changes, socio-political shifts, and ecological changes. And not surprisingly, the future of work is characterized by disruption to every industry, a transformation of working conditions, as well as evolving job skills and training requirements for the workforce. And so a large body of research on the future of work talks about technological advancement, and scholars and labor market experts describe technological advancement as occurring at a far quicker rate than any other period of history and affecting all areas of working life. Discussions on technological advancement have tended to center on the topic of automation, and a recent analysis of occupational data from Canada's Brookfield Institute aimed at examining the likelihood of a job being disrupted by automation. And what the researchers found was that about 42% of Canadians were at risk of having their job disrupted by automation. So a pretty substantial number. And kind of related to this specific grant, the jobs most likely to be affected by automation were those that involved low job skills, as well as those most likely to be occupied by youth and young adults. So clearly there's some important implications for young people with disabilities as they transition from school to work. And the grant that I was funded through Accessibility Standards Canada grows directly from some research that I have recently led on the future of work, especially as it relates to people with disabilities and other vulnerable groups. And so I recently completed an evidence synthesis to examine trends in the future of work that could impact the employment of vulnerable groups. And just at a high level, to summarize some of the findings from the study, what we found was that social changes like generational changes in the work environment, technological advancements like the growing application of artificial intelligence, political shifts like the increase in populist values, and environmental factors like climate change, as well as a green economy, could impact work conditions, as well as availability of employment opportunities for vulnerable groups of workers. We also found that the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated many of these trends that are expected in the future of work. And so the point here is that there are numerous ways in which the work environment could change for young people with disabilities, and we need to pay more attention to many of these changes when developing and implementing accommodations and workplace supports. Also, recent research that we led, we interviewed young people with disabilities and asked them about their thoughts and perceptions on the future of work. And again, these are preliminary findings and we're in the process of publishing them. But one of the kind of key themes that emerged from our interviews was that there was a number of anticipated barriers to meeting career aspirations in the future. And participants talked about environmental barriers like exposure to new digital technologies, which could result in displacement from their current employment, physical accessibility to workplaces and the community, which could continue to impact job opportunities as a person continues to transition into their career, an absence of supportive policies which are adaptive to new working realities, as well as continued perceptions of discrimination that could emerge as the types of jobs change, or maybe as jobs become more competitive, or in a work environment that relies more solely on gig workers. Participants also talked about personal factors like not possessing the technological or soft skills that employers demand. And these often posed barriers to meeting career aspirations. And another commonly discussed challenge to career aspirations in the future were the continued challenges of balancing work, life, and health needs that tended to be something that a lot of the young people in this research discussed. And so this is just a teaser to some findings that we have been really engaged in our research on the future of work, but it provides a really nice precursor to some of the research that we proposed. And I think one thing that's really important to highlight is that we often focus on the barriers in the future, but I think it's important to highlight the potential opportunities. And this is a really good quote. And so one participant in this qualitative study summarized the opportunities quite nicely. And they said, I think it goes back to that paradigm around disability that we can't seem to break out of. The world has changed so dramatically. Again, it may have been true and may still be true for some folks, but the world has changed dramatically that with the right technology and with the right procedures in place, you could pretty much do anything. And that really provides the foundation for the study that we were recently funded on. And so that research through the Accessibility Standards Canada aims to address two overarching research questions. The first is, what are the specific strategies like job accommodations, policies, and programs that could support the school to work transition for young people with disabilities within the context of the future of work? And what barriers and opportunities could young people with disabilities encounter to accessing supportive strategies within this context of the future of work? And so I think it's important to highlight some of the proposed outputs that we hope to produce from this research. The first and really important aspect is an integrated knowledge transfer and exchange approach, which we hope to really accomplish through this research. And that means engaging our community partners, as well as an advisory panel of young people with lived experience in all phases of the research process. And we've already started taking these steps. We also hope to design concrete recommendations for accommodation practices and programmatic development, as well as recommendations for policy change that address some of the anticipated barriers and facilitators in the future of work. We also hope to contribute to the design of workplace accessibility standards that can be implemented within different settings and, again, account for the future of work. And importantly, we really want to ensure that all research activities and knowledge transfer and exchange activities are completely accessible for people with disabilities. And so just a brief summary on the methods we plan to utilize. We plan to employ a Delphi survey. And so a Delphi survey is an iterative primary research process that collects and distills anonymous opinions and recommendations of experts using a series of questionnaires. And so over 2 rounds, we will survey young people with disabilities, as well as employment service providers, employers, caregivers, educators, policymakers, and others in an online consensus building exercise, which is the Delphi survey. Following the completion of the Delphi survey, we also plan to do some qualitative interviews. We plan to interview young people with disabilities, and we really want to examine how the implementation of workplace strategies that we've identified in the Delphi phase could really improve employment outcomes for young people as they transition from school to work. We also want to interview employer representatives and determine the feasibility and potential barriers to the implementation of each workplace support that we have identified within their specific context to truly identify how realistic are some of these recommendations that we've generated. And so we propose a specific timeline. And so the timeline spans 2.5 years. And we hope to accomplish each phase of the research process in this 2.5 year window. And although we list knowledge transfer and exchange activities towards the end, in fact, it is a cross-cutting element of our research. And so I'm going to leave you there. And I'm really excited that I was able to share some of our research processes with everyone in the conference. But I encourage you to reach out as you consider this research, and maybe there's opportunities to participate a little bit more. Maybe you want to learn more about the future of work and what it might mean for employment opportunities of people with disabilities. And so thank you again, and I look forward to taking some of your questions.
Thank you, Arif, for your presentation. And next, we are turning to Jutta Treviranus of OCAD University.
I'm Jutta Treviranus, the Director of the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCAD University. Our project concerns the future of work and equitable digital systems. I don't think that anyone will deny that every job involves digital systems, especially now during this pandemic. Although digital systems overcome many barriers, they also introduce new, more complex barriers. This is especially true in the workplace, as our regulations have focused on public-facing and not employee-facing accessibilities. The barriers include inaccessible interfaces, essential software that does not interoperate with alternative access systems, inaccessible file formats, authoring tools that fail to produce accessible content, inaccessible communication tools, and also procurement practices within the workplace that fail to select accessible products. And we continue to support a segregated digital access system, relegating alternative access systems to a niche assistive technology market with no economies of scale. The AT vendors have the impossible task of maintaining the interoperability of their products with an overwhelming number of systems that are constantly updating. And people relying on assistive technology cannot rely on mainstream setup, training, or maintenance. And this means that the system is broken more than it is functioning. A tragic and all too common scenario if you require alternative access is that there is an early enthusiasm by your fellow employees, which is stressed by time and budget constraints. Soon, you don't have access to the communication, which compromises your performance, and you become an HR problem. Artificial intelligence has been heralded as a way to address this. It is undeniable that there are many compelling stories of artificial intelligence as translator, whether it's images if you can't see, voice if you can't type, and sentiment translation, or things like captioning. AI is also used as an intelligent tutor to provide personalized training. However, this techno-solutionist enthusiasm is often used as an opportunity to dismiss accessibility issues and downplay the risks. And the risks to people with disabilities are many and daunting, whether it is treatment as the subject of data-driven decisions, barriers to participation in designing and developing data science, barriers to interpreting the outcomes of data science, vulnerability to data abuse and misuse, or the vicious cycles of data determinism. People with disabilities are often not recognized or understood by AI due to AI bias that permeates machine learning. This leads to bias in decisions and processes that use machine learning during data gathering, processing of data, analysis and interpretation of data, training or machine learning processes, and especially automated decisions based upon the data. There are several types of bias. Gaps and lack of representation occur because people with disabilities are excluded from studies, are absent from the digital traces that are used to guide the data, and often the data proxies used are inaccurate. Bias can find its way into the learning models because they reflect the patterns of discrimination in the data, because the developers of the systems are biased, or because of the inappropriate transfer of the machine learning to new situations and the overreach of automated decisions. One entrenched and fundamental risk is the risk brought about by statistics, where prediction and probability is based on statistical power and significance. From a data perspective, if we take all of the needs of anyone in any population and plot them on a multivariate scatter plot, we get a human starburst, where 80% of the needs cover 20% of the space in the middle, and the remaining 20% of the needs are scattered throughout the periphery. A pattern you will notice is that the needs in the middle are very close together, meaning that they're very similar. But as you move away from the middle, they go further and further apart, meaning that they are very different. Representation in decisions based on big data analytics and machine learning predictions requires a large homogeneous group. Disability often means you are a sample size of one. Your data will likely be eliminated or overwhelmed. Even if your data is not removed as noise in the data set, data-driven decisions mean that the majority rules. As a tiny minority, you will never reach the necessary statistical significance. As a result, predictions and automated decisions are highly accurate if you're in the middle, inaccurate as you move from the middle, and wrong if you are at the edge. But it is out at that outer edge that you find innovation and the early warning signs of risks to come. Even social justice efforts replicate the same data pattern at a smaller scale, causing exclusion within a protected group and leaving people stranded at the edges or falling through the cracks. To make things worse, people experiencing disability are most vulnerable to data abuse and misuse. Data protections don't work if you are an outlier or a small minority. And often, if you have a disability, you barter your privacy for essential services because accessibility requests confound de-identification. So what is the impact on employment in HR? It has an impact on hiring, whether it is through recruitment channels based on popularity metrics and profiling, selective filtering of applications for competitive jobs, which rely on data regarding who has performed well in that job. And if no one like you has ever been in that job, you will not get an interview. Application tests, screening for competencies, psychometrics, which all use AI, will be biased against you as a small minority or outlier. And even interview analysis, which is frequently implemented now, will eliminate you as an anomaly as well. It has an impact on training and onboarding. Learning analytics is used for training and upgrading. The inaccessible training interfaces will compromise your performance, and this will cause a feedback loop for ongoing machine learning, making it harder and harder to participate in the training. And people with disabilities face barriers to participation in data science. We find inaccessible data science tools and data visualization tools that are also inaccessible, especially for people who cannot use the visual. It also has an impact on performance and promotion, especially as workplace optimization through data surveillance becomes more prevalent. These provide incentives to ignore difficult clients or employees and are used to measure productivity and efficiency according to formulaic patterns that might not apply to you. And it even influences how well you can challenge workplace discipline and termination, because the assignment of responsibility is based on dominant patterns that don't apply to you, and AI decisions are often inscrutable, making it impossible to fight the basis of decisions regarding severance or termination. Our project will co-create resources to inform the development of standards that address risks and opportunities of digital systems with people who have lived experience of disabilities. And we would love to continue the conversation.
Our research project is titled Career Transitions and Accessibility in the Federal Public Service. This was initiated through the funding by Accessibility Standards Canada received by the READ initiative at Carleton University and a number of faculty researchers at Carleton. It is a one-year project that concludes in August 2021. And we're doing this in partnership with the two national organizations, NEEDS, National Educational Association of Disabled Students, and CCRW, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work. What we are aiming to do in this project is to study the barriers and facilitators for transitions for persons with disabilities into, within, and out of the federal public service.
The project has principal investigators who are researchers and professors at Carleton University. The team also has a research lead and a project officer and a group of research assistants who are currently students at grad and undergrad level at Carleton University and outside Carleton University.
So the project goals, these are to explore the journey of persons with disabilities throughout the employment life cycle within the federal public service, and we're looking at into, within, and out of the federal public service, and we're using an accessibility lens. So this means that we're going to be talking to people with disabilities about their experiences of applying to, working in, and also leaving the public service. And we're doing all of that considering accessibility and the barriers and facilitators to accessibility. And our second main goal is to inform the development of a critical accessibility map that can be used by organizations for targeted action and interventions for creating accessible career transitions. And this critical accessibility map will also be used to further support the federal public services accessibility strategy, and also the development of relevant employment standards under the Accessible Canada Act.
one of the underlying values of the project is that it's integrating and is informed by the voice of those people who are already navigating the barriers and perhaps experiencing the facilitators to accessibility in all of these key transition points. So for us, it's a holistic examination of what's working and what's not working, what could be innovated, and what we might want to see, what we see as potentially some gaps, as informed by the lived experience of those who are already navigating the barriers within the system. We also see that accessibility is related to the intersectional identities of those who are navigating those barriers. And so we are really looking to draw from communities across Canada, and in that way sort of have a very holistic view of the perspectives around what is causing a barrier, what is a facilitator that we want to see more of.
The project team will use different research methodologies such as qualitative and quantitative. The team will conduct a survey and interviews to explore the barriers and facilitators in the career transitions of persons with disabilities in their employment journey. And then we'll conduct focus groups to delve deeper into key issues that will arise from the survey and the interview. And also develop case studies and develop in-depth stories of specific subpopulations of persons with disabilities during their career transitions in the federal public service.
So to prepare for the research launch, the entire team did training in the ethical conduct of research and submitted the full protocol to for the Ethics Review Board at Carleton University. Before we submitted the ethics protocol, though, we spent a lot of time thinking through the best way to facilitate data collection, focusing on the needs and the abilities of the people in our sampling frame. So this was a substantial package to prepare and review, and the data collection is scheduled to begin in early December for the surveys and interviews.
Project deliverables. For this project, we will be producing a research report in an accessible format in both official languages, which will be made publicly available, and we'll be highlighting in particular the stories of persons with disabilities, experiences of their various career transitions with the Federal Public Service. We'll also be doing a presentation of this research report to key stakeholders, partners, government officials, and also to our funder, Accessibility Standards Canada. And finally, we'll be producing a journey map, that critical map of accessibility that I mentioned earlier, of employment with the Federal Public Service, and again, highlighting the key career transitions through an accessibility lens.
Participants in this study have the opportunity to share their lived experiences and their insights of the barriers and facilitators that they've experienced during their career transitions. And this will inform the outcomes of our study that were elicited before, including the improvement of the accessibility of the Federal Public Service. The participants' experiences and stories are going to inform the development of employment accessibility standards under the Accessible Act Canada, and the development of best practices for the workplace accessibility around career transitions.
Thank you so much for your interest in our project. We would like to invite you to engage and get involved in our project by sharing your insight on our recruitment strategy and sharing some non-traditional avenues for the recruitment of participants. As we've mentioned earlier, we are aiming to recruit persons with disabilities who are trying to get into or currently working or left employment at the Canadian Federal Public Service across Canada. So thank you again, and please feel free to check our website at carleton.ca for more information about our project and on other projects under READ department. And also, please feel free to email us at ask@carleton.ca. That's asd@carleton.ca. Thank you, and we look forward for your questions.
On behalf of the research team here at Carleton, we really want to thank you for joining us here today. And thanks to CCRW for having these engaging conferences and keeping these going in this time of different transitions. We're really excited to hear from any of you around your thoughts or your questions you may have about our research. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
And thank you to Boris and the team at Carleton for their presentation, and to all the presenters in this session for informing us of the important work underway on projects funded by Accessibility Standards Canada. These are exciting projects that we will be following closely. We will now turn to the live question and answer session.